Foundation Year Lecture Series, and we have a very distinguished alumni of the center. And as you know, we have been having some of the alumni also coming back and giving lectures under the series. Professor Tirthankar is quite familiar to most of you, but just in case, let me introduce, he's currently a professor of economic history at the London School of Economics. He did his MPhil and PhD at the center way back in the 1980s, completing his PhD in the year 1989. He has published very extensively on the South Asian history and development, has taught courses in South Asia and in global history. And he's one of the editors of the forthcoming reference work on Cambridge Economic History of Modern South Asia. He has a very large number of publications to his credit, and I will only just talk about some of his 2018-20 books, and all of them are quite interesting because I have actually seen one of them, which I have got with me here, which is the Business History of India, Enterprise and the Emergence of Capitalism since 1600. It's published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. He has a very recent book on economic history of colonialism, and that has got a very interesting cover page, and it is joined with Leigh Gardner and published by Bristol University Press. This is on order with the CDS library. Okay, and also another one, Law and Economy, a Young Democracy, India since 1947. This is also a joint work with Anand Swamy, and this is being published by University of Chicago Press. Okay, and his current research is actually on environmental history, focusing on the two-way relationship between climate and economic change. And so, Tirtho, welcome back to your alma mater, and the floor is now to you. Now, Tirtho has a lecture at the LSE, so he will be completing a little earlier at 3:20 p.m.
Yeah. Thank you, Sunil. And very good to be here. At this point, I cannot see anybody because I can only see my screen. I hope you can hear what I'm saying.
Yes,
there's no problem. The audio is fine, and that you can also see the screen. So we can
Yes.
assume that you are all there, and you are, and you can ask questions anytime if there is a clarification necessary. But otherwise, we will have hopefully half an hour of question session at the end. Okay, so just to start with a context for what I'm going to talk about today, let me just cite very randomly some of the things that are said about environment and economic change in contemporary India, in present-day India. This is the drought proofing is a phrase that Swaminathan Iyer used once. I got it from a newspaper report, so I don't know where he said it, but the statement that he made is that a region which has been historically very famous for droughts and famines in the past, like India, succeeded in drought proofing itself by 2010. So there was no major natural disaster of that kind after that, or it was handled pretty well. This is a very big achievement, no doubt, because the proximate cause of droughts has not disappeared. That is, monsoon failure or extremely dry seasons still occur, and if anything, they're going to be more frequent than before. Most people will predict that. So what really contributed to drought proofing is both extraction of water, but also distribution of water. That's quite a key intervention. But of course, that has a long history. And as that history unfolded, there is another kind of worry that emerged that water scarcity is going to be more acute. It's already quite acute in many parts of India. So here you have a random collection of statements which suggest that something dealing with water was a tremendously welfare-inducing, successful intervention, but also that it created some kind of cost. And both of these statements, the achievement and the price paid, surely has a history, and that led me into this project. I'm broadly interested in understanding how geography shaped the economic history of India. I'm, of course, coming into this not from a policy end, but from a from as a historian. And it looks like that I need a concept of the geographical condition of South Asia, which should have these concepts in it: water, seasonality, seasonal risk, drought risk. Now, as a historian, I find that much of the debates that I'm a part of nowadays do not really talk about these things. Geography is not completely missing from world economic history, much of which is a field that tries to understand the origins of modern economic growth and inequality. But most theories of growth or inequality, such as institutionist theories or theories of comparative investments, are usually bring in geography as a kind of witness in supporting stories about institutions or investment. And there's no single independent conception of what geographical condition really is or what it means. Similarly, in interest, and then another way that geography comes into long-range economic history is resource endowments, which is the notion that resources matter in shaping long-term economic change. But when you read what resources matter, when you read actual case studies of this, illustrations of this statement, you observe that it's very Europe-centered. The resources that matter to 19th century Britain are the ones that should matter to the rest of the world. And that doesn't satisfy you either. A third way that geography comes into long-range economic history is via trade and transportation cost, which is a very important concept, and of course useful in understanding market integration, market development, which are big themes in economic history. But they do not include a notion of climate, and therefore it's partial definition of geography. Similarly, if you look at environmental history in India, which is again an extremely rich and very well-developed literature, but you will observe that almost 80% of it, possibly 100% of it, is really about British imperial policy. It's a comment on empire rather than about environment as such. And for a very long time, there was a heavy accent on forest policy for reasons that I cannot explain. But probably because the forest regulation shows the actions of the imperial state much better than many other fields. The standard things that economic historians are interested in, such as economic growth, inequality, population transition, are as good as absent in this literature. Sorry. Okay, so to start with, then we need. I mean, if I want to bring in geography to the kind of economic history that I'm really interested in, and which should have seasonality, water, and risk in it, we have to start with a definition of the geographical condition of South Asia, and this can be easily done. By importing the phrase tropical monsoon from the Köppen-Geiger climate classification code AW. Now, what does it mean? What it means can be shown very simply by using two diagrams, two charts, one tracking maximum temperature monthly and the other average rainfall month-wise. And I'm comparing a Western European city, randomly chosen. You can replace Amsterdam with London or Paris. The message won't change. And tropical monsoon city, Delhi. Now, tropical means that the average heat is much higher every month, but during summer it goes up to very high levels. If you sustain 40 degrees Celsius for 2 or 3 months, most surface water will dry up or reduce substantially in extent. But of course, we know that the combination of the Indian Ocean and the extreme heat of the tropics, most deserts, as we know, in the northern hemisphere are located on the tropics. And if you have that level of heat sustained for any length of time during the year, life doesn't exist. But South Asia is different because the heat and the oceans create this very powerful hydrologic cycle called monsoon. And that brings a lot of moisture into South Asia. So South Asia is not exactly water scarce or a completely arid region like, say, Saharan Africa, but it gets its rainfall in a very concentrated way. So the tropical monsoon means that it does get moisture, but 80% of that occurs in 3 months. So what you have here is a sense of, okay, let me just use, hang on. Okay, let me use the world evaporation map, average evaporation map, that is millimeters per month, for 2 months in a year, May and August. May is very hot and August is just post-monsoon or middle of monsoon. What you observe, to illustrate this point about how skewed the rainfall can be and what kind of difference it makes. This is, I mean, you can see that there are two types of, well, there's a kind of very dark red here, or maroonish red in most parts of the world. The May graph is to the left. Sorry. The maroonish red shows you very low evaporation. Now, evaporation or transpiration, this is not actually a transpiration graph. It's actually evaporation graph. Evaporation is a function of available surface water and the actions of the sun. So if you have a very strong sun, very high heat, and not much moisture coming in from the sky, then all surface water dries up and you get this extreme red color coding. When you move to green or blue, especially blue, then that means that you have a lot of surface water. The sun may be strong, but the evaporation rate is very high because you do have a lot of surface water. Now, usually, if either you have a lot of surface water or the sun is not too strong and you have some, you get blue or green. Now, if you now observe the difference that May and August makes throughout the world, I mean, exclude the polar regions because they have very special geography. You will observe that some of the world's maroonish red desert-like climates don't change between May and August. Some of the green and blue coding remains true of both May and August, whether it's North America or in Europe. But South Asia, there is a very dramatic change. This little two blocks of maps will give you a sense of how very different these two seasons can be. Much of South Asia resembles the world's great deserts in terms of this evaporation map color coding during May, except, of course, the very deep south, which includes Kerala and parts of eastern delta, parts of southeastern coast. But by August, things change very dramatically. The monsoon has come in and you have very high evaporation throughout the region. There are not many regions in the world, if you observe this, the world map closely, which will show you this kind of dramatic shift. There are some which do, and one of them you find in the band just below the Sahara, the sub-Saharan Sahel, which have a monsoon, a much weaker one than South Asia, but it does have a monsoon, and you have a very similar kind of profile between these two seasons. There are a few other regions where, I mean, in some regions, the monsoon comes in a different month, but you have similar kind of profile. But South Asia is probably the world's biggest region, which shows this dramatic change. Now, what do all these charts and maps boil down to? Well, what it tells you is that there was a climatic constraint on economic growth, on intensive agriculture. The constraint was that extreme heat for part of the year dried up surface water, except where you have snowmelt coming from the Himalayas. That's the Indus and the Ganges river systems. Everywhere else, or even in the snowmelt areas, intensive agriculture would need public works, which recycle water, surface water, or mining water from underground, private works. Now, both are expensive and both were limited. And when they existed, They often reinforced economic and social inequality because not many people could access it. And if you cannot access it, then you are really poor. So seasonality of this kind, where part of the year is so dry that everything, that water disappears and becomes expensive to get, was a cause of poverty and unemployment in the past. It was also a cause of very massive seasonality. That is, wages and interest rates would rise for a few months in the year, fall in the months, with some allocation possibilities. Capital and labor could migrate between seasonally or between off-season and busy season somewhere else, but the possibilities were limited. Now, what you get in this region is not just seasonal unemployment, poverty, but also famine risk. If the monsoon fails, in regions like the southern Deccan Traps, where geology reduced surface water and made mining water costly. I'll come back to that point in a moment. So with that kind of background, the historical narrative that I'm developing here has two parts. One part says that rising water access and security from 1880 onward, roughly, enabled intensive agriculture, demographic shift, and urbanization. Not everywhere, because the problem was everywhere, but the solution wasn't available everywhere. But it did happen. The second part says that as this process unfolded, rising water stress rose, and I will define what that means in a moment. So the first part starts with the definition of a scenario, a kind of theoretical scenario where water is cheap, non-excludable, non-rival, you get plenty of it at very little effort, as you do indeed in many parts of Western Europe or North America or Japan. Compare that with the South Asian situation where there are more barriers to access to begin with, a scenario where most controllable supply of water, that is controllable by human action, which means that in the dry seasons you can mine it or you can tap it, were privately held with fairly strong forms of exclusion. I'll explain what strong forms of exclusion mean. What I'm suggesting in the first part is that these barriers weakened in the 150 years in question. And what I define by water stress is that as these barriers weakened and there was a wider distribution of water, shortages increased and also conflicts increased, conflicts over rights. That's what I call stress. Now, what's the evidence of this for this story of part one, rising access? First of all, the story I'm telling here is not a top-down effort. It's not a linear change, but it's a product of several parallel developments which happen, which kind of peak at the same time, sometimes reinforce each other, like equality movements, social protest, caste movements, often focused on water rights, but these disputes over rights then spilled over into courts and were settled in courts. So several different trajectories kind of joined together to create this rising access narrative. Now, what I'm going to do is talk very briefly about these four types of movements that I'm discussing here. And it's a good point to say that this is what I'm presenting today is a short version of this is appearing in a journal called the Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies. Some of you will know it. But it's also a big enough story to be told in the length of the book. So that's going ahead, and that's getting ready. And if you have any comments, any suggestions for me, any material that I should look at, I'll be very grateful to receive your suggestions. Now, start with famine relief. I, of course, focus, like many other historians on a particular time in Indian history, the late 19th century, the last quarter century of the 19th century, 1800s, when there were three massive famines that happened, as we know, in the Deccan Plateau region. The first one of these three, 1876-78, occurred in the area that used to be called Madras Deccan, that is the northern part of the Madras Presidency, or ceded districts, which is an even older name. But later it would be called Rayalaseema region, the Bellanatpur, Karnool, that area, Karnool, Kadapa. The second and the third in 1896 and 98, almost back to back, happened in the northern Deccan Trap region, the area, the vast area to the east of Bombay and Pune. Both of these form part of the Deccan Plateau region, which has two very distinct geological formations. I mean, one is the Deccan Trap, which is the product of late Mesozoic volcanic eruptions, and the southern region is the part of the old Gondwana land. But they both have hard rock formations, and both are very dry. So they are quite similar in that respect. That they're dry in the sense that they do not have snowmelt rivers like the northern India has, which means that if there is successive monsoon failure, the surface water will dry up, the rivers are no good, and that leads to a dependence on wells. And that is part of the story that I'm going to tell. Now, when we think of famines, and especially the famines of this time, there is a debate about whether these were natural disasters or man-made disasters, suggesting that, well, a drought is a natural disaster, but it doesn't necessarily become famine unless there's a human failure to supply food. And indirectly, it became a kind of comment on imperial policy again. Now, much of this debate is not really very useful. And these terms are not very useful because they are both rhetorical. Natural disasters, natural or man-made, can be used in a variety of senses, and most debates don't make a fine distinction. But also, there is a further problem that man-made or what human action is possible during a drought or a famine depends on what kind of natural disaster it is. And there is a big distinction between whether it's a shortage of food that is causing the famine or it's a shortage of water that is causing the famine. And I mean, technically, you can have human intervention in food distribution, have railways, have canals to grow more food. If it is a water shortage, man-made becomes much more complex and more difficult kind of concept. I mean, you do not have immediate recipes about how you solve the water problem. And that's part of the story that I'm going to tell. So these are the three famines that hit the dry Deccan Plateau. The second two were in the Trap region, where there was little surface water and where groundwater needed to be mined from hard rock layers. Now, whenever you have this problem that surface water is no good when there is successive monsoon failure, and that happened in India from time to time, wells are the only security. And the problem is that wells were private or communal property. They are not public property. Private property in water, especially wells-based water, was a legal and a ritual right, that is a caste-based right. Community wells in the 1880s, universally in India, but especially in South India, were segregated, and they were locally these segregation rights were strong. Private property was strengthened by state-defined legal ownership rights during the colonial times. So these two types of things, I mean, one is a caste-based right. I mean, ritual right, there's a lot written about what is a right to common property, or what is a right to anything, any property. And people who study the nature of rights would often understand rights as many-sided. I mean, there are, of course, some rights are legally sanctioned, but many rights are not. And these rights often come with right of a kind of positive right to access, but also a negative right of exclusion. That is, somebody else, a depressed caste, cannot use this water. They should not. I mean, they have a right, they have an obligation not to use this water. That kind of dual right, and many of these rights to water were of that kind. They were dual rights. There was a positive right and a right of and an obligation to exclude. These were further strengthened by private property right. Now, the second and the third of these episodes, I mean, the main evidence comes from the Indian Famine Commission, and the evidence is the interviews and district reports, which formed the main body of the report. And these are enormous documentation. One of the things that makes these three famines very distinctive is that they have thousands and thousands of pages of documentation. And if you read through that, of course, I'm not the first person to do that. I mean, many others have done it before, but much of this literature has missed what I'm saying here about water, taking these famines as famines of food. But if you read through this documentation, you observe that they are kind of shifting their main concern from a famine of food to a famine of water. And that is a very big shift conceptually and in policy terms. The concept of water famine emerges, and that is not just shortage. I mean, the 1898 and 96 and 98 famine are replete with references of how water table has fallen and how surface water have disappeared. But then they move to another institutional problem, which is that the water that remains is segregated. And that is creating a vast number of people more dependent, making them more dependent on contaminated surface water that still exists, where livestock and human beings are equally dependent on, leading to cholera epidemics and also caste biased mortality, which is a very big theme coming out in the famine documentation. Now, how do you respond to that? When it's a famine of food, the recipe was quite clear. Build railways to transport more food, build canals to grow more food when when rains fail. The thing is that railways to transport more food will not solve the water problem. And canals were built, but not built in enough intensity in the dry Deccan Plateau, because the standard way of building canals was to recycle water from a perennial river, and there were not many perennial rivers in South India, almost none. So you have to rely on wells, and here the problem came that the problem that still remains today, that wells are private property, and legally you cannot just requisition a well and distribute the water to the needy people. The Famine Relief Committee had no legal authority to do that. So despite this problem, despite this legal hurdle, institutional hurdle, by 1898, quite a few wells were created with the famine relief money, and quite a few wells were actually sequestrated, that is, taken over for public use, which established a legal concept of the public trust. It took enormous, more than a century, for that principle to be recognized as a legal principle, the public trust principle, and I'll come to that in a later slide. The famine documentation also showed, I mean, you cannot miss that message that mortality was caste biased, and caste biased because a very large number of people had weaker ritual right to the water that still existed, whether it's community or private goods. And this kind of statement came out again and again. And by the time you reach the early 20th century, you have a series of social movements and a series of court cases, especially in the Deccan Trap region, which were feeding into a movement for equality, broad-based movement for equality, which became a movement for equal rights to water sources. And we all know that Ambedkar's big breakthrough happened in the Mahad Satyagraha, which was about access to a communal well, communal tank. Sorry. Many of these battles were fought in the courtroom and after provincial legislatures came into place in political plane as well. The court, I mean, there are a huge number of court cases available on water, and many of these cases will tell you that the judges were not quite sure which way to go. If a group of depressed caste people say that we want rights to a communal tank, then the opposite argument was that the communal tank actually belongs not to individuals but to a temple or to God. It was a clash of different kinds of rights, and it was not a clash that could be easily settled on humanitarian grounds or equity grounds. So quite a few of these court cases had ambiguous outcome. Some of them went into arbitration of some kind, increasing in the 1930s as Gandhi and Ambedkar became kind of competitors for depressed caste mobilization, using very different arguments. The arbitration took political lines, but that's another story. It's a big story, but we don't have to get into the details of it. But this is one of the things that was contributing very significantly to making for a fairer distribution of water. At least the principle that communal tanks should be public good was recognized through several of the judgments about these cases that happened in the interwar period. And through it all, something happened that many historians have written about, which is the emergence of the depressed caste as a political subject. And water is quite a key mechanism in that. Now, as I said, it took more than a century for Indian courts to recognize that this fundamental problem that you need a well to survive, but the well is a private good, it's a private property, cannot make sense because the water that it is using should be common property. It's coming from deep underground, but that's nobody's private estate. So there has to be some way that law or intervention can recognize, deal with this contradiction. It's not easy to do that, but at least the principle is recognized formally in a Supreme Court judgment in 2004. But as I said, it's the famine relief which established that principle in the realm of practice. Now, none of this is very coordinated, but for quite a long time, well over a century, legislators understood that water is a field of intervention, but that it's not a field where there are ready recipes for intervention. You have to improvise, you have to work through different kinds of rights. The Indian Easements Act recognized communal rights to water. In some provinces in the 1920s, the eminent domain rule was applied in taking over big public bodies of water. But the wells problem remained unresolved, and it is still unresolved, despite the Supreme Court judgment. The wells problem being that the well is a private property, that is the little bit that sticks out from above ground, but almost everything else is common property. The famine relief, as I said, established a public trust in the realm of practice, but it took almost 106 years to generalize that rule. Now, one area where this contradiction has been very serious is cities, and especially the cities after the economic reforms. And the cities became a kind of hub of enterprise, but also this problem has become a kind of focal point of this problem, contradiction of wells. I'll come to that in a moment. The cities were an area. Now anybody can see that people who are managing water for a long time could not fail to notice that there is plenty coming down from the sky every season, and there should be, in principle, a very simple solution to India's water problem, which is to somehow impound or store what is coming down from sky, and then recycle it in the next season when there is dryness. And This idea had been used in canal irrigation, the impounding model, store water, recycle water, recycle monsoon water, for a very long time. Not necessarily a colonial time, so from centuries before, rulers knew that this is the way to go, impound water. And the canal irrigation became much more generalized and operated on a much bigger scale than before because of modern engineering. But in areas where there were plentiful surface water already. In the cities, the biggest cities in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century were the port cities in India: Bombay, Calcutta, Madras. These are not exactly water scarce areas. The monsoon is much stronger, and also the geography is somewhat different. I mean, although they can be, I mean, Madras used to be, or Chennai used to be very, well, it still is a very hot city, but and not served by very big water bodies or as strong monsoon as Bombay had. But it was still, I mean, all three cities shared one common feature, that they had more surface water and more surface water surviving the dry seasons than in the drier interior areas. So all three cities, administration in the late 19th century, much of this administration was Indian run. They understood that if they could, engineering technology could supply a simple solution, which was gravity, store water, and then use gravity to supply water through pipes. Bombay had, I mean, the three cities used this model in different ways, used this general idea in different ways. The Calcutta one using rivers, Madras or Chennai using, again, rivers, but much smaller ones, and Bombay basically impounding water in lakes and then recycling the lake water. At the same time, as these changes were happening in the cities, I mean, when you read the water supply system in the city, when you see the documentation on it, I mean, you observe that in the 1850, the cities were not much different from village, which is that most homesteads had wells, rich homesteads had wells, and the poorer people lived on communal well or surface water, which was often very contaminated. But as piped water grew, some of the wells disappeared, or the piped water served the poorer population, and piped water is for everybody. You cannot have segregation applied to piped water. So cities received more depressed caste population who often came from a segregation situation to a much more equal rights situation in the cities. And but as migration increased, I mean, not just depressed caste, everybody, as migration increased in the cities, partly because it was more water secure geography, often that imposed on the capacity of these systems and led to cholera and other epidemics. And because of this imbalance between, well, the cities solved the problem, but the moment they solved the problem, there was a wave of migration into the cities. They were forever water scarce. I mean, not exactly naturally water scarce, but because of migration, they were water scarce. Now, more recently, with the economic reforms, the city's water supply problem have changed. And of course, we now have many more cities, many more. The biggest hubs of the information technology cities industry is in the interior, not the ports. Interior is much drier, much more water scarce. And you observe that in the last 30 years, there's been a growing divergence in the way that water is delivered to the city population. The poor live on pipes, as they always did. But the rich people, the apartments, have gone very heavily into underground water, bore wells. And that has created the problem that this statement from economist is trying to discuss. It's mainly a management problem. So that's the first part, and the second part can be told very quickly. I think I need just another 5 minutes. The This is the part two of the story. Now, what this graph, I mean, there are many ways that you can show that South Asia is severely water scarce, but this is good enough. It tells you that there is an absolute shortage of renewable water, unlike the world's richer regions like North America, Europe, the world on average, or East Asia. South Asia is really indeed very special. And when you have that, extracting more or distributing more for whatever reason could lead to the risk that it will deplete stock and cause conflicts. This is what is called water stress, which is the percentage of freshwater withdrawal to freshwater supply. And this is shown in the graph on one axis, and the other axis shows average temperatures to suggest that, once again, I mean, India is very badly off on water stress. And what I want to show with the temperature is that this is something geographic. It's not anthropogenic, or it's not man-made. There is a geographical condition that shapes this comparative profile. The prehistory of the state of water stress in South Asia is this gravity schemes or impounding schemes. We know that it was tried extensively after independence in the Deccan Plateau. The solution to famine was to create 2,000 dams over rivers that could not take any more. I mean, not rich enough water-wise to sustain dams, but dams were built recklessly and leading to massive environmental problems. From the time that this impounding model died a natural death, the last one created was Narmada Valley. The last big one was created in Narmada Valley, and we know what kind of problems for almost 20 years that it created, political problem. The more water delivery shifted towards groundwater, leading now to a story of increasing depletion rather than insecurity. But there is also the other big story about hydropolitics between states, between nation states, over surface water bodies, over river water. So to tell you this story in full, I'm joining part one and part two together. I have this graph, which I call the water cross, which tells you I'm not going to explain in detail how these numbers were created, but in the long run, per capita water access has increased in this region. However you measure it, that story is quite sound. But at the same time, the exploitable water available has fallen. In many countries, many regions of the world, you might see similar water cross, but what is really worrying is the slope of these lines. And how close to x-axis you are in terms of exploitable water available. And on both these counts, South Asia is doing very badly. So with some lessons, let me try with the economic history lesson. Of course, I'm doing it as an economic historian, not as an environmental historian. The story is quite simple, that much of economic history, which compares Europe and India and then says that Europe did something to get rich and India did not do that to stay poor, I mean, it doesn't really make sense to me, because geographically, India and many tropical regions were based in faced a certain condition which Western Europe doesn't face. And they have a different problem to solve in order to reach a higher growth path. And much of my profession compares countries on per capita income, which again doesn't make sense, because per capita income is a composite of income and population growth. Now, in a famine-prone region, the biggest breakthrough in levels of living that you would expect is not income, but in reducing famine risk and raising population growth. And when that happens, when people start living longer lives, other things remaining the same, your per capita income will be depressed. Comparative historians draw the conclusion from that trend that nothing happened in India, but that's a very misleading story. Equally, the tragedy of the commons is also somewhat misleading. The default narrative, which makes many environmental activists very angry, is that the environment, nature is degrading because people are too greedy, they're consumerist. There was once a lot of cooperation about common property that is broken down, and that message comes back also from the writings of Garrett Hardin and Elinor Ostrom. None of this applies to water. Water access before modern times did not entail cooperation, but very significant structural social inequality. It's the wider access to the common, fairer distribution of commonly available water, which created a massive welfare outcome, but it also created environmental stress. And that is a very difficult problem for either politics or law to handle, to resolve. Finally, this is my last slide. I'm sure someone will ask here, or many of you are thinking about how this scenario will change with climate change. And I'm trying to read up the literature. It's very frustrating because people don't deliver the same kind of numbers. The numbers vary very widely, but one thing that does come quite strongly is that with 4 degrees Celsius, or between 2.5 to 4 degrees Celsius rise in average temperatures, the rates of transpiration or evaporation, seasonality, river morphology, precipitation, stream flow in rivers are all going to change. But they will change in a way that will increase flood risk, but reduce famine risk or drought risk, because stream flow is also going to increase. We do not know what kind of world that all these conflicting scenarios point towards, but it will not be necessarily a more water scarce world, but it will certainly be risky in other ways. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tirtha. That's a very interesting exposition of how, given the tropical monsoon climate, both economic and population growth is very much dependent on water security. So I think the floor is now open. You could ask questions, and those who are unable to ask questions directly can place those questions in the chat box.
Tirtha, I'm Ravi Raman.
Yes, hi.
Yeah, I mean, wonderful. I mean, very enlightening, very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Your observations, in terms of access and control of water, how the depressed costs were discriminated, and also how it triggered mobility, from the dry tropical areas to what is called the cities and like that. But last, you were saying something about the tragedy of the commons, and I was not very clear whether I should mean that you were saying this was some kind of a default narrative, and if that is a case, then I think I have a point to raise. Mm-hmm. My point is this: I mean, let us take your specific region, the Deccan Plateau.
Yeah.
Where you have this dry tropical forest, and because of this lack of what is called access to water, apart from the fact that they were moving to the cities, they were also moving to what is called the very rainy sort of high ranges as labor. So it was not that labor or people were migrating to the cities.
Yeah.
Rather, they were also migrating to the high ranges where they get more water and sort of thing.
Yeah.
Of course, they get more wages, income, or food and like that, particularly when they were recruited to the plantations.
Yeah.
So my point is this. My point is that whether we could still stick on this point that this tragedy of commons is a default narrative in this particular context, because the very historical fact that these plantations were raised through a series of deforestation. which had its impact on climate change, water access, and also on food, because it was a monoculture. So how do we continue to say that this tragedy of the commons was is a kind of default narrative? I'm not sure whether I have heard it right.
No. I think that's a wonderful question or comment. Allows me to clarify a few things. I mean, I think when I say tragedy of the commons, when I mention that, I'm very specifically talking about groundwater. And the idea that groundwater depletion, which is now very well documented that it is happening all over India on a very serious scale. I mean, how do we read that? What I was saying is that if you follow the tragedy of the commons narrative or rhetoric, you will see it as a reflection of excessive use, excessive consumerism or greed or private power. To use common property, and that leads to depletion. What I'm saying is that, and that of course is the tragedy, that there is not enough regulation or cooperation in using a common property. That's the tragedy. What I'm saying is that regulation or cooperation is not the problem. The problem is that water is scarce resource, and you need it to survive, and you need a fairer distribution. And the history tells us that that did happen. With significant effects on demography or economic change. So you cannot call it a tragedy. It is a problem nevertheless, because it is a scarce resource, but that has to be looked at from other perspectives rather than a tragedy and then blaming capitalism or private greed. It's a bigger problem. It's paid for a hugely welfare-inducing move. That's the lesson of history. What you said is, of course, very relevant. And most climate change models nowadays try to model something like this cycle of effects, deforestation or excessive loss of biodiversity or biosphere, leading to climate change, leading back to a certain kind of environment with changed precipitation, changed stream flow, all that. So it's a kind of it's a cycle where human action on what we call biosphere happens first, then the climate changes, then a different biosphere emerges, and again human action on that biosphere will change the environment. It's a cycle, and that's how it is usually modeled. But what is missing from these models is the historical story and also the human story about who are these people. And of course, when you get into that, whose action is changing the environment and who for it and what options they have. That's the kind of thing that you said. I didn't know this migration to the high ranges. I was just making a note here, and I will probably explore it, discuss it with you. But there are, I would imagine that this is one of many human stories that will need to be told to make this model much more realistic or historical. And this is one of them. So that's relevant.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I want to come in.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a very, it was very interesting the way you brought in the caste, and the way they suffered and the disadvantages and the movements. We know that provisioning of water is mostly in the hands of women. They're the ones responsible for bringing water to the household, to provide water in the household in some way or the other. So I was just thinking, in your historical narrative, is there now no mention of how it affected the women?
That's a very interesting question and a very relevant one. Well, there is actually, there is, what you have in mind is when there is a surface water source or a well that's located very far away, and mostly it's the job of the women to water from that source back to the household. That is, you are absolutely right, that's very much a women's sphere. And in quite a few modern as well as historical, but more modern surveys, that aspect is much more fully described, much more fully covered. There are surveys which show how much time that goes into that activity, and that is a time taken away from what women could potentially do as a worker, as an earner, and that's part of a kind of fringe development discourse, but it does exist. And I have seen similar references in historical sources as well, not very well developed. I mean, people didn't pay much attention or weight to it, but it exists. However, much of this story that I told is focused on rights, and rights are kind of gender neutral in this case. Much more rights that belong to households, families, private parties. It so happens that when it is legally recognized or asserted, it's often a man who would hold that right. But that doesn't exclude the women within the family. It excludes whole families outside or communities outside. Does that kind of answer your question, or?
It does, but I would have been solid pieces of history which do narrate this. So it's okay. I mean, but I just wanted to know if it is at least recognized in the historical literature. That's what
okay. Let me make a note of it, because I'll look for more material of this kind.
That would be very interesting, Tirtha. Thank you so much.
Okay, Tirtha, there is a question in the chat box by Sam Ghosh.
I can see that. Yeah, let me. Yes. So thank you for the question, Mr. Ghosh. And this is, what may be the impact of the project of interlinking of rivers or inequality of water available? I guess you can all read the chat message. So let me read it silently, and then I'll try to answer that. Yeah. Okay, all right. So there are two questions here, and one of them is about, well, both are about inequality of water availability between regions, between peoples. The first one is about interlinking of rivers, and the second one is about rich housing societies tapping groundwater, something that I mentioned as a big problem in the cities. I know they are very interesting questions. I do not have a ready answer to that, but I can tell you kind of outline of that answer. I'm not, but I don't know the physics part of the discussion about interlinking. I mean, I think there is a big political lobby working for it, because it makes the construction lobby enormously rich for a very long time to come, if it does happen. But I don't think geographically it's a very good idea of linking water. I mean, as it is, fundamentally the idea is that you have snow melt in the Himalayas, and probably the Himalayan rivers are going to get more water in future, because the snow melt will increase if global temperatures increase. So why not recycle some of that water to down south? It's through channels. It's not easy to imagine that will be an immediate or an obvious solution, because many of these Himalayan rivers are themselves being shared by larger number of people. Some of them are silting away, some of them are not very well maintained. The canal systems in northern the Indo-Gangetic basin, both Pakistan and India, are at their maximum capacity. Some of them have, the Green Revolution has outstripped that capacity and moved into groundwater. We know that in Punjab there is a massive problem of groundwater depletion, and nobody believes that canals are an answer to that to general water shortage. So before we move into that solution, I think I would like to see that there is a viable, stable river system working in the snowmelt regions, and that's not the case. And that river system is under serious crisis. India and China has been from time to time come to blows. They did in 2017 somewhat silently, and in 2020 very noisily. And behind these conflicts, it's not, I mean, of course, if you have seen the pictures of where they do these battles, I mean, these are completely barren. I mean, you would wonder why would any country want to possess those lands? The problem is that both of them, and that region is the source of some of the biggest rivers of Southern Asia. And China depends on them, India depends on them, Pakistan depends on them. All three are militarily very strong countries, and all have a stake in controlling that particular land area where some of these rivers originate, both to access water and also to avoid sudden floods. River conflicts is a big part of hydropolitics, is a big part of the reason why India, Pakistan, and China often fail to cooperate or even come to much more serious disputes. So, depending, I mean, this idea that use the northern rivers to help southern India or drier India, I don't think is a very good idea at all, because the northern rivers are not a very stable, reliable system, and much of that morphology is decaying. But your second question about rich housing societies drawing underground water away, you are absolutely right, and that's happening. It's a very big subject, and I mean, I read the works of many people who are writing about it, about how the groundwater draft has increased tremendously in the last 25, 30 years. And behind that groundwater draft, and there's, of course, one that story is that the impounding model is not working anymore politically or environmentally. But the other part is that the people who are drafting groundwater, who are drawing more groundwater, have economic power, whether this is rich farmers in Punjab or rich service professionals in the cities. And there's no immediate legal or political solution to this problem. Most cities have this scenario that municipal pipes serve the slums, and the poorer sections, the richer sections live on borewells. But I don't know that there is a legal redress to that. We know the theoretical legal redress, which is to declare all underground water as aquifer water as public property. But it hasn't happened. There's a kind of design of laws, but no one has actually implemented it in practice. So this inequality is going to remain with us. But of course, there is another solution to it, which is to work on the demand for water or use of water and curtail that, rather than changing the supply system, because that is legally much more complicated.
Okay.
Can I come in here? One question. I'm
Yes,
Vijay
of
Shankar.
course.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Vijay Shankar. Hi, Tirtho.
Hi.
One question, when we were talking about groundwater as common property, etc., one issue is that groundwater has a very huge role in meeting or reshaping the regional inequality in India. If you look at the irrigation map of India in 1970s, the irrigation was largely confined to the valleys and plains, and upland regions did not have access to water, and groundwater has brought that parity between regions, and the areas like Telangana, many regions have come up because of access to groundwater. I think that should be, I don't know, that's covered in your narrative. And secondly, when you talk about the right to water and the groundwater and the rich farmer versus poor farmer, the point is that 66%, I mean, 2/3 of the irrigation structures, including borewells, in the country currently are owned by small and marginal farmers. Obviously, they form 80 to 90% of the total farming population. So the association of tube-wells with rich farmer is not a very stable narrative anymore. I think many poor people also have access, even though not equal access, but that I think has done a tremendous role in sort of giving a livelihood options to them. The groundwater is very closely related to the livelihoods of the people. I think that aspect one must remember. Is my submission. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's no dispute with any of that, and that's certainly clarifies the situation much better. Yeah. Okay. So we have one more chat question. Water intensive farming and crops, especially in the Deccan. That comes from Devika. Thank you, Devika. I think I'll deliver this question to Vijay Shankar. It is a question about water intensive farming and crops, especially in the Deccan. Would you like to spell out the question?
Yeah, if Devika can explain, it will be better. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Devika.
Now, I was just thinking about cotton, for example, and
Yeah.
there are different crops. Like in Kerala, for example, paddy, spread of paddy replacing millets, for example. And this is quite closely connected to the changes that happened over the 19th century and after. I'm just asking you about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'd ask Vijay Shankar to talk about the Deccan, but I know from based on impressions about what's happening in the second green revolution, paddy-based green revolution in West Bengal and Bangladesh, which was very intensive in groundwater. I mean, entirely intensive in groundwater and underground water.
Yeah.
And it was also very democratic because it was, as Vijay Shankar said, it's tube well based. Canals need a lot of money, but tube wells are a much more democratic kind of investment. But that led to this massive problem of depletion, arsenic poisoning, and all sorts of things. I mean, my home is in one of these areas which experienced the second green revolution, and I can see how the well water level has fallen almost 30 feet in 30 years. I mean, that's real crisis. Vijay Shankar, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would say much more than cotton, sugarcane is a very big issue in the second area, particularly Maharashtra, because that's a guzzling crop and it has come up and it has displaced many other crops. I mean, many other millets, etc. And we constantly hear of places like Marathwada going dry, even Western Maharashtra, many places going dry. I think that's very closely related to spread of irrigation or for water guzzling crops. Obviously, there were a lot of policy support, a lot of incentives for them, procurement and so on. And one need not even talk about Punjab and Haryana. We know what's going on. I'm sitting in Delhi right now. There's a huge riot agitation going on of Punjab farmers against the bills, farm bills. Most of it is related to the kind of cropping pattern which is going on there. So this water intensive crops, spread of them has definitely replaced a lot of older crops, traditional crops. And in areas like Madhya Pradesh where I work, the situation is much more serious. So using the same procurement mechanism, can we promote crops like millets and pulses? That's something that we can think about. We should think about, I think, the policy. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Surabhi Nayak, why don't you ask the question?
Thank you, sir, for this fascinating presentation. So I'm Surabhi, student at CBS. I think you are beautifully trying to show the intersections of climate change and social inequality. But I was just wondering about the role of state. So be it colonial or say post-colonial state, the kind of role that they play in shaping the water rights, especially in the context of India, for instance.
So, I mean, you want to know more about the role of the state. That's the question. No, that's a very big subject, of course. And I mean, as I said, I think, and probably the other experts in this audience will confirm me. I mean, this is not a story about a top-down state managed transition, because it is just too big a problem for any states to control. And also, of course, I mean, in India's federal setup, as it took roots, much of the water management issues were delivered to individual state governments. So that makes for 26, 30 states rather than just one state. But I think the state's agency can be seen most clearly in implementing the impounding model. That's the only one area where the state was both designer of a policy and the implementer of that policy. Creating dams and creating urban water supply systems, which was not exactly state managed, but state was kind of indirectly an agent. Most urban systems came up through corporations or municipalities, which were actually elected bodies. And it's one of the first elected body where Indians had a lot of representation. I mean, these were rich Indians, but they had a lot of say. But it is still statist kind of agency in that it lived on taxpayers' money. These were funded by taxpayers, by taxes. So that kind of, I mean, in my impression, that's the only one area where you can clearly see that the state has played a role. And of course, it's a hugely complicated area because it created a lot of environmental stress. Eventually, when the state gave up the impounding model, stopped creating more dams, it then moved to subsidizing wells, and that created other kind of environmental problems. Everywhere else, I think this water story or water access story is not a statist story. It's happening at the level of society. It's happening at the level of politics. It's happening at the level of courts and law, and a variety of ways that this battle has been fought. Of give us more water, but it's not always between state and people. It's also sometimes it's very significantly between people and people, and you see that conflict both in agriculture and in the cities. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that would be my take. I mean, somebody else could dispute that.
Thank you, sir, for the response.
Okay, any further questions?
On the last question, can I add one comment?
Yeah, please, please.
Yeah, if you look at the role of state, as Tirthankar rightly pointed out, I think in India, in the water sector, there is too little state, I think, right now, in terms of regulation. In terms of incentives, giving perverse incentives like the one that Devika just now asked about promoting highly water guzzling cropping patterns, state has a major role. But if we actually look at in terms of regulation, Groundwater Act, a lot of states have passed Groundwater Act, but it's not operational anywhere, almost anywhere. And when you talk about of water, if you look at the Marx kind of view, that 1850s, Marx wrote about the kind of hydraulic societies. So that is a view which I think dominated our thinking for a very long time. But the actual story in the water sector has been, as Dr. Roy rightly pointed out, people-to-people interaction, communities controlling water, of course, with the support of state. And I don't think the legal framework or the rights framework has changed fundamentally in any way that would enable the communities to take over water. So states' regulatory aspects are important, but states' role as a controlling water was very, very low. It has been low historically, and it continues to remain very low.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's right. And I'm glad that you bring up the Marx, and one can follow Marx with adding Wittfogel and Ferdinand Brodel. All of that, all of these people had this general vision of Asiatic societies as water-based or based on water control, and then they brought in a conception of the state which is actually regulating and delivering water to scarce water. But I mean, if you read these stories, I mean, you will see that they are really not strong on geography. I mean, they are trying to create a theory of the state, that Asiatic states are different from European states. And Asiatic states are much more despotic because they had this big job to do. And but of course, as you said, the water story is not a stated story, nor is the geographical situation that of complete scarcity, but seasonal scarcity, which is a very different problem and completely unrecognized in some of these classic writings. So the classic writings, Marx, Wittfogel, has actually created more problems than they solved. They misled our idea about, say, state, society, and water in a direction which has no relation to real history.
And this hydraulic society type of idea does not even hold for China, I think. Not only India. It doesn't seem to apply anywhere in the Orient. The Oriental despotism doesn't seem to prevail anywhere in the Orient. It is only in the imagination.
Yeah. Hi, Sunil.
Yes, who is going to ask the last question? We have, I think, 3-4 minutes more.
I wanted to ask one thing. So I read your paper. You have mentioned a lot about seasonality. When I missed a little bit of the earlier part of the presentation, I don't know whether that's covered in this presentation. Your paper has a very interesting discussion on the seasonality associated with agriculture and water availability and so on, because we follow the monsoon climate. So how that shaped economic activity, and particularly a lot of issues like credit markets and kind of dealing with people, commodity trade, etc. I think it's a very, very rich ground for further research. I don't think how seasonality influences interest rates is a kind, for example, a very interesting topic which somebody can take up. I don't know whether that's covered in your discussion. Otherwise, you can direct it and make something on it, or direct it to your paper.
No, not in this discussion. I think, I mean, I didn't mention seasonality in labor markets or capital markets at all. But you are right. I mean, that's part of the story. The whole thing about water is that, you know, we often get carried away by this arid area discourse that India is water scarce. But India is water scarce because of excessive use, of course. That it is water scarce. But fundamentally, the Indian problem, if you go back a century, is not an absolute scarcity. It is seasonal scarcity. And that's a very different problem from something that you would find, say, in the sub-Saharan areas. Now, seasonal scarcity means that the problem to solve is not making more water available, but making more water available across seasons. That is equalizing the water access between seasons. That is recycling, reallocation of water. And that is a very different problem from the arid area problem. Equally, the parallel problem that you find in labor and capital markets is that for 6 months in a year, capital has no investment avenues, labor has no employment, and what do people do? Once again, I think the way to think about it is in terms of reallocation, whether it's migration. Reallocation is a broader idea because that includes the capital market, but it's happening. It's happening in on many levels. The thing is that, I mean, you cannot really tell a general story because it's so micro. I mean, you can collect, I mean, like Ravi Raman earlier mentioned about a particular very interesting kind of migration, which had shades of caste in it, but also shade of this insecurity in it, water insecurity in it. And people are leaving their home. I mean, this is a region which has, where labor has always been extremely circulatory, extremely prone to migrate. Capital too has been prone to migration. We haven't studied that enough, but these are kind of stories that fit into this general reallocation model, that if you have seasonality, you will think about moving goods, moving assets across seasons and between regions. I'm doing that a bit more in the book that I'm writing, not in this paper.
Do we have time like that, Tirtho? Can I ask then one more question?
Of course, yes, please.
Oh, thanks. It's something connected with your reflection on rights.
Yeah.
The doctrine of public trust, you have mentioned the quoting the Supreme Court sort of versions, and how Supreme Court legitimized the doctrine of public trust by extending the right to access to water. That's quite interesting. And since you mentioned this new social movements also, I would just bring your attention to the what is called the Anti-Coca-Cola struggle in Kerala.
Right.
Actually, at that time, the social movement activists were raising this point, and the High Court was also negotiating this particular doctrine of public trust. So I find it very interesting that to what extent it's so powerful even now, or rather in negotiating the rights. But at the same time, I'm not that convinced about your position on rights. When you say in response to Mrudulipan, again, it's not very clear here that the rights are gender neutral. Is that true? I mean, do you think that you can still hold on that? Because particularly when you find, as Mrudul has rightly mentioned, access to water, and it was essentially an activity undertaken by the women, and that was more or less connected with the patriarchal norms and also other kinds of things in the then existing society. Even in the so-called modern society, we still find that it is women who ultimately go for accessing water and like that. So
absolutely,
I'm not sure to what extent your position on rights as gender neutral is valid. I would say it is neutral.
Yeah.
Non-gender.
I completely agree with you. I think I mean, we use rights very loosely, of course, but I mean, the stricter definition of rights would be something that is written in a book rather than which emerges from relationships between people, and the legal rights which apply to everyone. Or if you go back to Dharma Shastra and stuff on water that is written out there, it's often framed with reference to caste. These rights do not distinguish between men and women. The implication of these rights will affect men and women differently, and I think that point is very well taken. So when I was talking about gender neutrality, it's strictly the legal right, which is written in a book, which doesn't distinguish between gender.
Thanks.
There is a final question, and I would like to take that up from Manikanta Nataraj. Would you? Okay, let me read that clearly. Drinking water and industrial water. I think that's the. Yes. No, this is a very important question. I think what you are asking is about the use of water and whether there's a conflict there and whether something could be done to reduce the usage. And I think that's a very important area of, if not intervention, I don't think usage or demand management is something where the state can immediately, poke its nose and make things better. It's very much again ground level kind of activities, but there is a lot that is happening there. The aggregate effect we don't know, but certainly in agricultural use, I mean, drip irrigation, for example, is one technology which is coming into use, and there is now plenty of evidence to show that it's very effective, both economically as well as in terms of demand management. But it has other problems, and it's expensive. It doesn't appear everywhere. It is very specific to certain contexts where it can work. But there are potentially other types of demand management, both industrial use and the Coca-Cola example shows gives us some insight into that, as well as drinking water use, where the use can be the field of action rather than supply, and which has this much more complicated and more unsolved problems of rights.
Okay, I suppose now you have to go for your lecture.
I do actually, yes.
Yeah, and I must thank you very much for